In 1735, a ship called the Göteborg left the harbor at Gothenburg, Sweden, loaded with silver. Its destination was Canton, China, loaded with silver.
Its mission was simple: bring back tea.
The voyage would take over a year each way, through pirate-infested waters.
Around the southern tip of Africa, across the Indian Ocean.
Entire crews died of scurvy, shipwreck, and disease on these journeys.
And they did it for dried leaves. That sounds insane.
But people risked everything, bankrupted nations, started wars, and literally redrew the map of the world for this plant.
A plant you can buy for $3 at any grocery store today. That tells you something.
Tea is not just a drink. It never was.
So how did a wild shrub from southwestern China become the most consumed beverage on the planet after water?
How did it topple dynasties, fuel revolutions, and reshape global trade for centuries?
It reshaped global trade for centuries.
This story starts almost 5,000 years ago in Yunnan province, China, around 2700 BC. According to Chinese legend, Emperor Shennong was sitting beneath a wild tea tree.
Emperor Shennong was sitting beneath a wild tea tree, while his servants boiled water for him to drink.
A few leaves blew off the branches overhead and drifted into the pot. A legendary herbalist and curious experimenter decided to taste the accidental brew. He tasted the accidental brew rather than dump it out. He liked it a lot. Now that story is almost certainly a myth. Shennong himself may not have been a real person in the way we think of historical figures.
But the core of the legend lines up with what archaeologists and botanists have confirmed.
The Camellia sinensis plant is the single species that produces all tea.
Green tea, black tea, white tea, oolong, all of it.
It originated in the Yunnan region of southwestern China. People in that area were chewing tea leaves and brewing primitive versions of the drink.
Thousands of years before anyone in Europe knew the plant existed.
For centuries, tea was primarily medicine.
Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty, around 200 BC, reference tea as a treatment for everything. From headaches, to digestive issues, to fatigue. People ground the leaves into pastes, pressed them into bricks, and boiled chunks of those bricks in water with salt, ginger, and sometimes onion. If you ordered that version of tea at a coffee shop today, you would probably spit it out. The transformation to something people enjoyed, drinking for pleasure, happened slowly.
Over hundreds of years.
But the real turning point came during the Tang Dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 AD. The The Tang dynasty ruled China from 618 to 907 AD. The young scholar was an orphan, raised by monastic guardians, who became obsessed with the art of herbal infusions.
He spent years traveling across the land, visiting tea-growing regions, documenting preparation methods,
And cataloging different water sources.
This was the first known book in human history entirely about tea.
The comprehensive guide covered everything: how to grow it, how to process the leaves, the scholar turned the herbal brew from a casual folk remedy into an art form with rules, techniques, and philosophy.
With rules, techniques, and philosophy behind it.
The Tang Dynasty emperor was so impressed that tea became a taxable commodity for the first time. The government realized they could make a fortune regulating it, and they did.
but here is where tea's story gets bigger than China.
Monastic practitioners had been drinking herbal infusions for centuries to stay alert during long meditation sessions. As Buddhism spread along trade routes into Korea and Japan, the monks brought tea with them. In the eastern lands, the brew arrived centuries ago. A monastic traveler served the infusion to the noble sovereign. In 815 AD, and the emperor liked it so much, he ordered tea plants to be cultivated near the capital.
The sovereign ordered tea plants to be cultivated near the capital.
Japanese tea culture really exploded when another monk, Eisai, brought powdered green tea, matcha, back from China in 1191. Eisai wrote his own book about tea's health benefits and promoted it. He promoted it to the noble warrior class as a way to stay focused and disciplined. The samurai warrior class used it as a way to stay focused and disciplined. The samurai loved it, and the Japanese tea ceremony evolved into one of the most refined cultural rituals. The Japanese tea ceremony, known as chanoyu, evolved into one of the most refined cultural rituals in human history. A 16th century tea master named Sen-no Rikyu codified the ceremony, emphasizing 4 principles: harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Every movement, every gesture, every placement of the cup had meaning. The tea room itself was deliberately small, sometimes only 4.5 tatami mats, forcing even the most powerful warlords to bow low upon entering. Rank and status were left at the door.
Rank and status were left at the door.
The ceremony was about presence, respect, and finding beauty in simplicity. Meanwhile, back in China, tea culture kept evolving. The Song dynasty shifted from boiled brick tea.
The Song dynasty lasted from 960 to 1279.
It shifted to whisked, powdered tea. Then, during the Ming dynasty, starting in 1368, loose leaf tea became the standard. Loose leaf tea became the standard. People started steeping whole leaves in hot water.
Which is basically how most of the world drinks tea today.
By this point, tea was flowing along the Silk Road and maritime trade routes into Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Tea reached Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually the edges of Europe. Traders in historic trading hubs were buying and selling fine herbal tea.
I told you, these are the finest saffron threads in the entire souk. You won't find better quality.
The quality is good, my friend, but the price must be
But Europeans themselves were late to the party.
The Portuguese were the first Europeans to encounter tea through their trading posts in Macau
In the early 1500s, but they treated it as a curiosity, not a commodity. The Dutch were the ones who saw the business opportunity. By 1610, Dutch traders were importing tea from China and Japan into Amsterdam. Within a few decades, tea drinking had spread among wealthy elites. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In 1662, King Charles II of England married a Portugal princess named Catherine of Braganza.
Catherine was already a devoted tea drinker.
And suddenly drinking tea became fashionable among the English aristocracy. If the Queen was doing it, everyone wanted to do it. Within a generation, tea went from an exotic novelty to the national drink of England. Tea houses popped up across the historic city. The British East India Company realized that tea was about to become their most profitable product. Tea was about to become their most profitable product. And that profit motive is where this story turns dark. See that the manifests match the cargo precisely. We cannot afford discrepancies with this shipment. And China did not want British goods in return. The Chinese emperor famously told King George III that China possessed all things and had no use for British manufactures. The trade was entirely one-directional. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to pay for tea. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to pay for tea, and the imbalance was becoming a national crisis. So Britain found something China did want: opium. British traders, operating through the East India Company, began growing opium poppies in India and transporting massive quantities of alternative trade goods. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese people were addicted to opium, and the social devastation was catastrophic.
When the Chinese government tried to crack down and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium in Canton Harbour in 1839,
Britain used it as a pretext for war. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. Britain won decisively.
forced China to open 5 ports to foreign trade, and seized Hong Kong. The Second Opium War followed from 1856 to 1860, with similar results.
All of this, the wars, the addiction crisis, the colonial seizure of territory, was driven in large part by Britain's desperate need to keep the tea flowing.
without bankrupting itself.
But the British had another plan running simultaneously. They wanted to break China's monopoly on tea production entirely. The
future of the tea trade rests on this, Robert. I understand the gravity, sir. I shall not fail.
And traveled with 2 local guides who helped him pass as a local official from a distant province. Areas where outsiders were strictly forbidden. The local masters guarded their tea secrets carefully. He packed them into specially designed glass cases called protective botanical cases.
That kept the plants alive during long ocean voyages.
He also recruited 8 Chinese tea experts, men who understood the processing techniques. Where elevations reach high altitudes, and the cool mist provides ideal growing conditions.
He also sent plants to the Assam region in northeastern India,
where a wild variety of tea plant had already been discovered growing naturally in 1823.
Within 20 years, Indian tea production exploded.
British-owned plantations in Assam, Darjeeling, and later Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, were producing enough tea to supply the entire British Empire.
Enough tea to supply the entire British Empire.
China's centuries-old monopoly on tea was broken. The cost was enormous, and not for the British.
Plantation labor in these regions was highly demanding. In Ceylon, workers spent long, demanding hours cultivating the vast fields.
The Chinese emperor famously told King George III that China possessed all things and had no use for British manufactures.
You there, put your back into it. We expect quota, rain or shine.
If you are finding this interesting, feel free to follow along. We cover stories like this regularly, and you will not want to miss what comes next.
The ledger confirms the delivery, 7 pence per pound. See here, the route through the straits is clear now. We can expedite the next consignment.
Tea was playing a very different role on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. By the 1770s, American colonists were drinking enormous quantities of tea.
Careful, it's steaming hot.
Much needed. This blend is excellent, darling.
It really is cozy in here.
But the British Parliament had imposed a series of taxes on the colonies, including the Tea Act of 1773. which gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America.
And included a tax the colonists had no say in approving.
On a quiet winter night in 1773, a group of citizens gathered at the harbor. Some, disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. That is roughly 92,000 pounds of tea, worth about $1.7 million in today's money. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was one of the defining acts of defiance.
We will not be governed without representation. We demand liberty!
That led directly to the American Revolution. In a very real sense, tea helped create the United States.
And it also explains why Americans drink so much coffee.
After the Boston Tea Party, drinking tea became associated with British loyalty. Patriots switched to coffee as an act of political identity. That cultural shift stuck, and to this day, the United States remains one of the few Western nations where coffee dominates over tea. The United States remains one of the few Western nations where coffee dominates over tea. Back in Britain and its empire, tea culture was only accelerating.
Afternoon tea became a fixture of British social life.
Which was served fashionably late, around 8 or 9 at night.
Afternoon tea became a daily ritual for millions of British people across all social classes. Across all social classes within a few decades. Factory workers in Manchester drank strong black tea with milk and sugar. Lords and ladies in country estates drank it from fine china. The Industrial Revolution turbocharged tea consumption even further. Tea was cheap. It provided caffeine to keep factory workers alert during grueling shifts. And the boiling water required to brew it killed bacteria that made untreated water dangerous to drink.
Some historians argue that tea literally made the Industrial Revolution possible.
By keeping workers alive and productive.
By the late 1800s, tea was the lifeblood of the British Empire.
It was grown in India and Ceylon, shipped on British vessels, traded through British ports, and consumed in British homes at a rate of roughly £6 per person per year. The shipping it sold became a spectacle. In the 1850s and 60s, the great tea clipper ships raced each other from China to London. They raced each other from China to London, competing to deliver the first cargo of the new season's tea. That cultural shift stuck, and to this day, the United States remains one of the few Western nations where coffee dominates over tea. The most famous race, in 1866, saw 5 clippers leave Fushu on the same day, and arrived in London 99 days later, with the Taiping beating the Ariel by just 20 minutes after a 14,000-mile voyage. Crowds gathered at the docks to watch the ships arrive. Newspapers covered the races like sporting events. Tea had become entertainment.
Then came the 20th century, and tea started changing again.
He was trying to sell hot tea to fairgoers, but the summer heat was brutal.
So he dumped ice into the tea and served it cold. Iced tea was born.
Today, roughly 80% of tea consumed in the United States is iced, and it remains one of America's most popular beverages.
Despite the country's overall preference for coffee. He started sending tea samples to customers in small silk pouches. The customers, not realizing they were supposed to empty the tea out, just dunked the whole pouch in hot water.
It worked.
Sullivan switched to cheaper gauze bags, and the tea bag industry was born.
Tea purists, especially in China and Japan, still look at tea bags with disdain. But for the average consumer, tea bags made brewing a cup almost effortless.
And that convenience drove consumption to record levels worldwide.
The 20th century also saw tea culture evolve and diversify around the globe.
In India, chai became the national drink, a spiced tea brewed with milk, sugar, cardamom, ginger, and sometimes cloves and cinnamon.
Chai wallahs, street vendors selling freshly brewed chai, became as iconic to Indian cities as hot dog stands are to New York.
Chai wallahs, street vendors selling freshly brewed chai.
In Morocco, mint tea became a cornerstone of hospitality.
Refusing a cup of mint tea in a Moroccan home is considered deeply impolite. The tea is poured from a great height to create a frothy top.
And it is served 3 times, each cup representing a different value.
In Turkey, tea replaced coffee as the national drink in the early 20th century.
After the Ottoman Empire lost control of coffee-producing regions.
Turkish tea, called çay, is brewed incredibly strong in a double-stacked teapot and served in small tulip-shaped glasses. Turkish tea, called çay, is brewed incredibly strong in a double-stacked teapot. Turkey now consumes more tea per person than any other country on Earth.
Over 6.5 pounds per person per year.
Over 6.5 pounds per person per year. Turkish tea, called çay, is brewed incredibly strong in a double-stacked teapot and served in small tulip-shaped glasses. At elevations above 14,000 feet, where farming is limited and the cold is extreme, butter tea provides essential fat. At elevations above 14,000 feet, where farming is limited and the cold is extreme, butter tea provides essential fat, calories, and hydration. And then there is the matcha explosion. For centuries, matcha was a niche product, reserved mainly for Japanese tea ceremonies and Buddhist monasteries. Reserved mainly for Japanese tea ceremonies and Buddhist monasteries. But starting around 2010, matcha went global. Matcha lattes started appearing in coffee shops across the United States and Europe.
Health food stores marketed matcha as a superfood loaded with antioxidants.
Instagram lit up with photos of bright green matcha drinks, matcha ice cream, matcha pastries.
By 2020, the global matcha market was worth nearly $4 billion and growing fast.
The global matcha market was worth nearly $4 billion and growing fast. A ceremonial tradition that Buddhist monks had practiced for over 800 years had become a wellness trend on social media. A ceremonial tradition that Buddhist monks had practiced for over 800 years had become a wellness trend on social media.
Today, tea is produced in more than 50 countries on every habitable continent. China remains the world's largest producer,
followed by India, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Turkey. Global tea production exceeds 6.5 million tons per year.
And over 2 billion people drink it daily. That is nearly a quarter of the human population starting their morning the same way.
In Turkey, tea replaced coffee as the national drink in the early 20th century.
In Kenya, tea is the single largest export crop and employs more than 3 million people.
In Tibet and the Himalayan regions, butter tea, made by churning tea with yak butter and salt, has been a caloric staple for centuries.
The tea industry generates over $200 billion annually worldwide.
And every single leaf of that tea, whether it is a high-altitude Darjeeling first flush picked at dawn by hand, the only differences are in how the leaves are processed after picking.
Green tea is heated quickly to prevent oxidation. Black tea is fully oxygized.
Oolong falls somewhere in between. White tea is the least processed of all.
One plant, thousands of variations, 5,000 years of history.
Tea started as an accident. A few leaves blowing into a pot of boiling water in the mountains of Yunnan. It became a medicine, then a luxury, then a tool of empire, then a catalyst for revolution.
Then an everyday ritual for billions of people.
The cup you brew tomorrow morning connects you to Tang Dynasty scholars debating the ideal water temperature. To Japanese samurai, perfecting the art of presence.
To British soldiers in the trenches of World War I, brewing tea under artillery fire.
Because that is what you do when the world is falling apart. You make tea.
It was one of the first items rationed to guarantee supply. The wars that were fought over this leaf, the espionage that was committed to control it, the labor that was exploited to produce it, all of that history lives inside something most people treat as completely ordinary.
All of that history lives inside something most people treat as completely ordinary. Tea is never just tea. It never was.
And you will want to be here for them.